the Tech Capital's first ever industry panel with 3 leading experts in the industry. I've got here with me Nicola Hayes, founder of Andrasta Consulting. I've got Rabbetts, Managing Director of the European Data Center Association. And I've also got Willner, Chairman and CEO of IXcellerate. Guys, what does it feel like to be back in a room?
Amazing! Very strange, but amazing.
Well, this is my first time interviewing in-person people since February last year, so it's been...
I had to decide what to wear on my bottom half instead of staying at the giant bottoms.
That's wearing a suit. Yeah.
Yes, well, I've got a jacket on for the first time in 15 months.
Yeah. Well, you're lucky that those fit, because mine's it was a nightmare this morning. But look, even though we went through the whole COVID thing, I mean, for the industry, this has been an exceptional year in terms of growth. What do you think was the most disruptive thing that has happened? Who wants to go first?
Should I go? I mean, just acceleration. You know, we all knew with digital transformation that it was a one-way street and it was going to carry on, but the speed of which things had to adapt, you know, just in my other world, in education, for example, yes, we might have started doing a little bit of online learning. That could have taken another 5 to 10 years. We've had no choice. We're not going to go backwards. We're not going to stay online teaching, but that will stay. So all of those things that we've had to get used to, whether it's using online video conferencing, in personal as well as work, that won't disappear. It will pare back, but that has been accelerated to a huge amount, and obviously that has massive implications for data center storage, for network infrastructure. Online shopping, you know, the acceleration in terms of people who wouldn't normally use online shopping, having to use it again. We'll see that pare back a little bit when life gets back to normal, but it certainly won't go back to pre-COVID. So the acceleration of the uptake in digital services, digital technology, Peloton. I mean, who'd have thought that sitting there on a little static bike in your house would become the new big thing? You know, that again, people will go back to gyms, but they're not going to get rid of that technology. Again, the implications for the infrastructure with the enormous uptake of home gyms, it's vast. You know, the implications going forward, even when it becomes a bit more normal and more face-to-face, we're not going to go back to pre-1920? 100 years out of date, pre-2020 levels.
No, I mean, that makes sense. There was also this study from McKinsey that shows that we've kind of evolved 7 to 9 years in terms of digital adoption. So we're actually not living in 2021, we're living in 2028, 2030, and it's not going to change once the pandemic is over. And then Alex, from an European perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, I think just what Nicola said really, that everything that's happened over the last year, you know, the fact we've all moved to going and using online video call, you know, for conferences, for calling, for meetings, and as Nicola said, for personal life, and the online shopping again, you know, Nicola's absolutely right. We're not going back. You know, this is going to be a form of the new normal, because whatever happens, we're not going to go back to all commuting into our offices and working in the way that we did. We may do some of that, but we won't do all of it. The world has changed, and it will stay changed.
Yeah, it's definitely not going back there. And I said you were the CEO of IXcellerate, but also the CEO of IX Africa. Chairman, sorry. We don't take anyone's roles here.
I'm not carrying the can for everything.
But where I was going to go with it, you are across several markets, 2 very interesting markets as well, Russia and Africa. Give us your view of what's been disruptive in the data center space.
It's what Nicola and Alex have been saying. It's exploding. So we're seeing an acceleration of decision making as well. Instead of having to pop out to the site and have a look and keep the tyres and then go to the headquarters in Santa Clara or wherever and have discussions, it's all on Zoom. And this starts happening, you know, really quickly. So we're seeing an explosion on the whole take-up. And you know, in Moscow we've just been overwhelmed with demand. And that's both from, in Russia it's interesting because you see the whole Russia cloud verticals. So, you know, you've got some big cloud verticals like Ozone, which is on NASDAQ, it's like 11 billion market cap now. It's raised in 600 million, so it's investing in Russia now. So you've got some of these, you know, more unlikely companies, you know, like Nicola was mentioning Peloton, you know, more unlikely companies suddenly popping up and becoming enormous users of data center capacity.
Yeah.
I do think though, sorry to, but there is a downside to all of this as well from what Guy's just said there about that acceleration and the quicker decision making. Brilliant, quicker decision making, but I think we might get bit in the bottom a little bit down the line because some of this was so rushed. Yeah. Was so hurried that the infrastructure decisions, very key decisions for larger companies, smaller companies, were made at speed. And I do think maybe over the next 18 months we'll see a little bit of that come to the fore that needs sort of re-engineering.
That's typical in the industry, because what you have is you have cycles. So everybody's suddenly super optimistic. Gosh, I need to grab that land. I need those 8 megawatts. I need those 10 megawatts. Leroy, Jane, go and secure me some real estate here. Then they secure it, and they say, then they go to the IT team and say, yeah, I've got you 8 megawatts. I said, we don't actually need that much. So there will be probably a digestion period while everything comes.
I think we'll see it within 18 months.
Yeah.
Why are you saying that just for the colocation?
The whole across the hyperscalers as well, but infrastructure as a whole.
Yeah. Could be undersea, could be everything.
The whole caboodle. Looking at it in a holistic internet infrastructure package or IT infrastructure package, I think there will be pain points along the whole thing where it needs to come back a little bit. But I think it'll be 18 months before we see the.
And that change won't necessarily be bad. I mean, it's, it could be good change. It's just an evolution. Yeah.
And it's something that companies need to be aware of, not just suddenly look at some of these analyst forecasts and go, well, this is where it is. It's like, I do think there will
there is a wall of capital at the moment, desperately trying to find places to put money. And if you go out into Mayfair tomorrow and wave a flag saying, I'm doing dark fibre in rural England.
Here's my money.
Here, have it.
Money. That's right. I mean, you just take it. And that is going to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I find this amazing. I think one of the biggest examples I've come across was Microsoft, which last year they brought 100 megawatts online just in the space of 2 weeks. This is between their own data centers and colocation and all sort of things, but it's just tremendous amount. I mean, 100 megawatts.
Yeah, but then if you look at, my funny emerging markets, which some people call Edge. So Lagos allegedly is Edge, and yet it's the capital of 200 million population country. But it's the same as Northampton, really, isn't it? But you look at the Netherlands last year, they built 180 megawatts, or the industry built 180 megawatts of data centre in the Netherlands in 1 year. That is the total capacity in the Russian Federation, with 11 time zones. So I'm not worried in emerging markets. I think a lot of this is going to start flowing through, and the emerging markets is 2/3 of the globe, and that's great news. So the next 5 years we're going to see everywhere from Colombia to Chile to South Africa to wherever, building out infrastructure, and that's really cool.
Yeah, well, I mean, over the years we've been very focused on the flat markets, so Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, oh God, Paris, and then Dublin now as well. But I think we are now moving to the emerging markets, but then I think you're right as well, because those being, some of the emerging markets that we say they're emerging or edge markets, they're actually going to be the biggest markets. When you look at India, when you look at a lot less in Africa, when you look at Russia, South America, I mean, we used to call Brazil an emerging market. We've got more than 200 million people living. I mean, that's the US of the Southern Hemisphere. Part of the problem is with all of these, and Guy obviously knows this because of the Africa side of things, and I've worked fairly extensively on investment projects across Africa with data centres over the last 5 to 6 years. One of the benefits, I think, of the whole pandemic is that governments have had to actually sit there and review the internal infrastructure, because obviously data centres, co-location, edge, they don't exist in this tiny bubble, they're part of a whole, and if that underlying infrastructure isn't there, then it doesn't matter how many buildings. It's like having a bunch of service stations and no motorways connecting them. But governments have realised that actually, because everything went online, because they've got no choice but to actually start that investment.
I don't think that governments have actually recognised still what a data centre is.
No, of course they haven't. They've realised.
It's still understand.
They've realised it's the network capacity. It's that, particularly in Africa.
What I'm trying to explain is that governments are still not actually understanding what data centres are or what their purpose is. So although they have come onto the agenda, and they definitely have come on the agenda, and we're seeing that right away in Europe, certainly in the European Union, it's happening everywhere. Data centres are on the agenda, but they're on the agenda with people who don't know what they are.
Yeah,
so,
that's a very fair point.
And I think as an industry, actually, we're partially responsible for that. Because as an industry, I think, and I've been saying this for a while, we need to learn a new language. Because, we're still talking, and we've done it here, talking about megawatts of power, etc., etc. And we talk about how much floor space we have, we talk about how many megawatts we have, mine's bigger than yours, etc., etc., etc. But the reality is what we need to be talking about is what the benefits are that we bring. And if we were, instead of saying, actually, I've got 100 megawatts under reservation, we were saying, actually, you know what? Through my data centre, I am enabling the video calls. I'm enabling these things to happen. I am doing things that are going to help the sustainability message, and so start messaging the benefits rather than I've got 100 megawatts. Because I think as an industry, we're terrible at that.
But in Europe, it's a very different situation. One of the problems and one of the blockers, because the demand is there in places like Africa, the blocker has been that underlying networking infrastructure. And I think if nothing else good comes out of this pandemic, the fact that those governments now realise that investment has to go there because they really struggle.
Has to happen, so then investment comes in.
Yeah.
So that then should speed that process up, because that's been an issue for, for as long as,
If you compare Ethiopia to Kenya, Kenya has a completely deregulated regime. You've got loads of people laying dark fibre or whatever. The Ethiopian government's trying to encourage inward investment, but they've got one network operator, so nobody's going to go there.
And until that is addressed, the rest of it can't happen. It doesn't matter how much money goes in or how much we say the enabling factors of the data centres, they're not going to work.
But in terms of what you say, it's quite interesting, because when you start going east, and Russia is kind of sits between Asia and Europe. I was at a data centre conference about a year and a half ago, and the Deputy Minister of Communications stood up to do his usual speech, in its wonderful data centres. But in fact, he had a map of Russia, and he said, look at these cities. Look at Novosibirsk or Khabarovsk, the latency is terrible. And I thought, somebody from government understands the word latency here. So I went and congratulated him. I said, you're either very smart or very well briefed. But the fact is, you're looking at this. And there was a thing in the press this week in Moscow. The federal government has said they've signed an edict, because you can do these kind of things in places like Russia and Singapore. Basically, the government decides that there is no democracy, and they've decided that governments, any government department, is not allowed to invest in a data centre. That they must use commercial data centres. And that's a really forward-thinking thing.
Absolutely.
Some European countries should think about that rather than wasting taxpayers' money building white elephants.
Absolutely. I totally agree. KX, yes.
Which is going to cost a few billion euros to the European taxpayer, which I guess is not a problem for the UK anymore.
Let's not mention that one.
But look, that was very interesting. This conversation is bouncing off, which was excellent. Let's talk about maybe taking risks, because this industry is not known for taking risks. Is there a tolerance for risk-taking in the data center space today, or do we need more of that?
What do you mean by risk?
Just going out there and doing things a bit more openly. So I guess in a way, going back to the point of talking a different language, but even on the development side of data centers, trying new things, trying new technologies, so bringing in different AI technologies.
I think there's an appetite for that now. I think that's being driven by the fact that data centers are on the agenda of the politicians that don't understand what they are. And I think there is an appetite to say, you know what, if we keep on building data centers in the traditional way, putting in cooling systems, using fossil fuel generation, etc., we're never going to actually get to the sustainability that we need to achieve. So, we are starting to say, well, actually, there could be other ways of doing this. What about hydrogen fuel cells? Could we use hydrogen fuel cells as backup power? It's possible. Can we do something with the cooling? Do we need to cool these servers? They're not actually. They don't mind the heat. Actually, most of them, not extreme heat, but same as my old thing I've been saying for years and years and years. Why are we still lighting up data centers? Computers aren't scared of the dark. Just turn the lights on. But this sustainability thing is huge. But what I think it's doing is it's driving operators and builders and developers to start thinking outside the box and start saying, actually, there is a different way of doing this, which I think is a really important thing to do. Because if we just carry on, I hate to say this, but the industry has always sort of said, we use bleeding edge technologies. Well, we don't. They don't do that. I remember seeing somebody at a conference a few years ago stand up and say, I've got adiabatic cooling in my data center. Well, fantastic, but the Egyptians invented that 4,000 years ago. I think we need to start thinking outside the box and saying, no, there are different ways of doing this, and using AI and machine learning to manage the facility to stop all this reactive maintenance and start saying, well, actually, let's use AI, let's use machine learning and say this could be run better by a machine than by a human, which is generally the case. And this is why it will be more efficient, and that efficiency can then pass on through other measures.
I think what the problem is though, we're so siloed, because again, you can't do that in a bubble. You need to be working with the server manufacturers, with the M&E people within the facilities, with the network people, and a global or even a European R&D fund that looks at all of that for the industry as a whole would lead to leaps and bounds in that. But we
your
active
client is saying, I've got an extremely strict service level agreement.
Yeah.
If you deviate from 1% from that, I'm going to hit you with a 50%
Yeah.
fine. So you think, okay, I'm just going to
do it the way it's always been done.
That was going to be my next point as well, especially financial services.
Yeah, but that's precisely the point. Is everybody's signed up to SLAs that they're terrified of change, and as an industry, we're terrified of change, but we have to change.
We're also terrified to say when things go wrong as well. And I know Advanced's initiative, DCERN, which is that anonymous reporting system for data centre outages, bloody brilliant idea.
Yeah, brilliant.
Based on airline.
Yeah.
I am
I don't know what you mean by
gobsmacked.
I've never had an outage ever in any of my data centers.
But do you know what? I'm absolutely gobsmacked that it's anonymous reporting,
Yeah.
that more companies haven't signed up for that, because the learning from it, and that could be something else that then goes into better ways of doing something and bring the sustainability into it. But until people will work together, we're a little bit.
I agree,
stuck.
but I think we're in danger of losing sight of one thing. A data centre is an entity in its own right. Yes, the service manufacturers need to address the problems that they cause, but actually we can do this as data centre builders, operators and developers on our own. We can make facilities much more efficient, much more sustainable.
Absolutely.
On our own. Yes, we want to show, if we do that, we'll show the server manufacturers that actually they've got to get their act in order.
But imagine if they all work together
Well,
on
they
a
never-
solution,
but they never
put
will,
all
will
of
they?
it together.
They never will, that's the whole problem.
I would love to see it happen though, because I think that's the only way to sustainability.
But I think we're going through a cycle now where the bankers are very much involved in the industry, and the buyers are to a certain extent, the volume buyers are relatively limited in number. And so what's happening is this is perfecting down to very much a financial model. It's an Excel file built in data center these days, in which case the room for innovation has disappeared because there's just no spare capex to do anything out of the ordinary. So it's got into a very, very refined model. It's a kind of one size fits all, and we'll have to have a little bit of a revolution to move into
Which
the next level.
I totally agree with you there, but I still say, because I like to disagree with you,
And you've been disagreeing with me for 20 odd years.
Exactly,
Don't stop
I'm
now.
not doing. But whilst I think you're right that it would be great to see the manufacturers, the software developers, the M&E engineers, the builders, and the operators, and everything all working together, we need to be realistic. That isn't going to happen, and therefore.
But why not?
But because it isn't, it isn't. But therefore, let's not say, well, we can't do it then. Let's say actually we can do it. We can do our bit. And that will encourage the others to work with us in the future. But if nobody starts doing something, then we'll never achieve anything.
And then that's risk taking. And then if you look at risk taking in another sense, then risk taking is investing. And it's clear that I see probably far too much investment in Western Europe and the US.
I was just about to say, I think one of the problems and one of the reasons we've become much more risk averse in design, in how these things run, is because of the investment money. Because the investors that I see and I speak to at the moment are not your typical investors that we saw 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. Institutional investors, it's pension. They want a business that is up and running, that is 3/4, that has got guaranteed income, and that is it. Yeah, 10 years ago, we saw people that wanted to go and build a greenfield and new designs and new. There's tons of money out there, but it's very different money to where it was, and I think that is a big blocker for any form of innovation.
Outside our comfortable Western markets, there's a lot of fun being had, and that's potentially where the innovation comes from. And we might find that some of that leapfrogging in technology and ideas of how to build a data center might come partly through necessity, but partly because there's less competition in those markets. The money is more venture capital rather than sort of pension funds, and so there's some interesting stuff going on anywhere from South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, etc.
I mean, there's so much I can pick up on this. I'm a European billion, but picking up maybe on the money being invested, especially in the US and Western Europe, we now have an average of about $10 billion being invested a month this year so far. I mean, where are we going to go from here? Because I know there's a lot of consolidation happening. I know there's a lot of brands out there looking for buyers. But are you one of them?
I'm running two processes at the moment. I'm raising money in Kenya and I'm raising money in Russia. And my money raising in Russia, we were saying, we'll be happy with this number, with X, if we raise 100 million on X, and we're at about 1.5x now at the moment in valuation. So the interest is strong. I've only just started raising money in Kenya for my business there, and that's going to be super, super exciting. But those are crazy way out markets. If you're raising money in Western Europe, it's probably really easy
Well, yes and no, you'd think that, but part of the problem is a lot of the investors that certainly I'm speaking to at the moment, they don't want to just come in and invest as an investor. They want to buy.
Right.
They want to own.
Okay.
They want to, and I don't think that is healthy for the market overall, and particularly the amount of money that is splashing around there. I want a ready, up and running business. Don't have to do anything to it. Don't want to just want X amount of guaranteed returns over a 10-year period. And of course, then you hit problems like EBITDAs are through the roof at the moment, so it becomes too expensive to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that is blocking innovation.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think one of the problems that we've got in Europe generally and in the Western world is that there's been too much money. It's become very easy. Now the investors want something. You know, they're seeing the industry as something which it's safe money. So they want safe businesses, and they want to go and put in, as you say, they want a business is up and running, and they want to return on their investment straight away. They want a guarantee.
They don't want to do anything to it. They don't want to make it more sustainable. They don't want to make it.
And that's bad for the industry.
Absolutely.
And again, I mean, I was in India last year before the pandemic. A week, and it was really interesting to see what's happening in India, because in India, where money is more venture capital driven, and there's a lot of money around for data centers in India at the moment, and the innovation is there. You know, you're seeing though that innovation that I was talking about, looking at different ways of doing things, not necessarily traditional cooling and power, etc., etc. That innovation is there, and that's what's got to happen to this industry. But it's got to happen everywhere. You know, the European model is either going to die on its own feet because it doesn't change, and all of these emerging markets are going to change, and they are going to get the innovation, and they are going to get what they need. So the European market then just dies on its feet, or it's going to have to change, and that's going to be really painful.
But it will change, and it has changed in the past. I mean, when I started back in the day, which was only last week, in 1998.
You were a telehousing company for telecoms equipment.
I got my old PowerPoint job.
When we all started,
it
was still a tiny.
I know.
I went to your one in 1999.
Oh dear.
So I remember seeing a BT data centre with carpeted floors that was being offered to me at £6 a square foot. Yeah. And that's always stayed with me, thinking, you might think your business is valuable today, but tomorrow it won't be. And post.com crash, we picked up a €60 million investment in Munich from Carlisle, I think it was. No, KPN Quest, that one. €60 million data centre for €1. €1, because we just took on the underlying lease, which is a warehouse lease. We bought the Frankfurt 55,000 square metre campus for €14 million, including everything, including 2 plants or whatever. So what may happen is, if we get a correction in, say, October, and QE stops a little bit or stalls for 6 months, people start saying inflation's going up to 5% this month or whatever, interest rates are creeping up. I mean, some of these highly leveraged, highly financially structured deals, 2% increase means bankruptcy. And that's what you do need in an industry every few years. It's a bit of a clean out. So Europe will go through a bit of a clean out. The strong ones will remain, and some of the sort of highly leveraged ones without real management teams who are just basically financial.
Will end up becoming distressed stock.
They'll become distressed. But it's other people's money anyway, so who cares?
Who cares? Just move on to the next one. Right, this brings up, there is a lot of stock out there across Europe in those markets, the flagged markets, and any second tier that has got a long history. There are buildings there that are practically empty, that run maybe with 1 or 2 clients, that are not fit for purpose anymore. I would love to see those being used to do that experimentation, to do the reverse, to do all of that. The big companies, the Equinixes, the Digital Realties, the Cyrus Ones, have a sub-brand. I don't know, colocation by Equinix instead of an Equinix. So you've got that Equinix guarantee that it's going to work, but you can make it more niche for certain things, or you can be more, look, this is our flagship in terms of, sustainability. Rather than these buildings just sitting there and dying.
You're making a really valid point about the other buildings. Forget Flat D. That's kind of done anyway. But there are 2,500 operators in Europe. And some of them are tiny
with hardly any tenants.
And what they've got is they've got all these data centres that have been fitted out but they're 20 years old. And they don't have the money because they don't have the clients. They don't have the money to reinvest and turn them into something else.
And the investors aren't interested in those at the moment.
Of course they're not interested. But that's where the bigger players could come along and do some innovation at really low cost to them and very low risk.
You got the same issue. You know, it's a bit like people saying, you know, all these mobile phones that are useless in Europe, let's just ship them to sub-Saharan Africa, and you ship them to a market in Lagos, and the guy says, what's that?
That's ridiculous.
I'm sorry, I want the latest Xiaomi phone.
But guys, most of these buildings.
Because if you look at, you know, a young team that's coming in that wants to do some innovation that might work in the sub-brand, the problem is what they've got in the boot of their car is an NVIDIA A100, and that's a supercomputer with 3 million moving parts, 3 million not moving, 3 million parts in it, and it pulls 6 kilowatts, and you put 5 of them in a rack and it's 30 kilowatts. Even a normal data centre built in 2021 can't cope, let alone
But imagine if some of that money that's flying around at the moment, where they want safe investments, imagine if some of that went into, because I worry for sustainability. These buildings are going to end up as big white elephants that are going to be blocks on the landscape, that don't do anything. You know, it's like the old, with the old telecoms houses. We repurpose those for the industry. First of all, through enterprise, they took them on for their own data centres, all of those. They'd have just sat there and gone to rack and ruin otherwise. We've got a lot of data centres that are going on.
You're talking about the evolution of the industry there. I mean, you're talking about, you know, what started as maybe carrier hotels that eventually became co-location out of necessity. These legacy data centres that we're talking about that are already 20 years old, what's happening is they're getting to the end of their end of life and they're not being repurposed into something else. I mean, I can think of at least one data centre where they just rammed a digger through the side and now use it for salt storage for the roads. You know, they're not getting repurposed, and they should be, because there is still a market. I mean, we've all talked about demand. The demand is there, but it's got to be good money that comes in. It's got to be clever money that comes in, not safe money.
But then again, you've got you know, that's a wider issue. I mean, it's a wider issue of sustainability in general. Is that you know, you build a skyscraper with 25 floors, and then 12 years later you knock it down and build another one, and that is horrific for the environment.
Yes. And
you know, within planning laws, there should be things saying, if you're going to build this, you know, it's got to be up to 25 years. There is no planning permission granted to knock this down for 25 years. So you've got to think about how you build it now. You know, we've just bought a brewery in South Moscow, and it was only operating 14 years. And it's got massive concrete reinforced things that supported the cylinders for storing all the liquids. Well, we're going to reuse those for our cooling towers, because to knock them down would take us about 6 months anyway, and then we pour a whole load of new concrete in a different shape. But we need to actually work out how to reuse all of that architecture. And I think reusing those legacy data centers.
I'd love to see some of the money that's flying around going into that, and I'd love to see some of the big brands put their names behind it to make it successful, and for them to be used as almost an R&D.
Yeah, but again, you make a very good point though about planning, which is, and that's a problem again across Europe, and I suspect other markets too. Is, you know, the planning officers need to understand what they're granting permission for. And I agree, you know, a building shouldn't be getting put up and then being torn down again in 5 years because it's going to be repurposed. The building needs to go out, and I think 50 years, 70 years. You know, it should be there, and that would encourage the repurposing of these facilities. And using them properly, which just doesn't happen at the moment.
And that would drive up the base price per kilowatt of data centre from wherever it is today to maybe 10-20% more, which would have zero effect on the end user, or maybe 0.1%. But so these become sort of accepted, you know, myths and legends in the market that, oh no, you can't sell for more than 100 in Frankfurt or whatever, and therefore you have to build a crappy building that's going to last 5 years, and therefore you have to do it cheap and cheerful. You can't innovate, you can't do anything. So you're driven down to the lowest.
And then you've got to look at you're right. We've got to stop the real estate agents. I'm going to say this, and it's very controversial. Stop selling sheds, because that's what they do. They think they sell data centres. They don't. They sell sheds. They sell distribution centres that were built as distribution centres that happen close to power and comms, and say, "Oh, I've got a data centre for you." No, you haven't. You've got a shed. You know, and they've got to move away from that. They've got to start actually valuing data centres, because they don't know how to do it at the moment.
I think the point you made as well about reproposing some of parts of the building, even when you buy a shell or just building the building, it's very good. It really takes you back to the planning board. It starts with designing the building itself, it's the architecture and the building design to make sure it's sustainable. I'll go back to the editor in a second, especially because of you two, but sustainability, do we believe the industry is going to be 100% green by 2030 or not? Like everyone wants to say yes.
I'd love to say yes.
I'd love to in Russia, but I've got nuclear and I've got gas, and I don't know if I can get enough green by then. So in a good Western manner, I'd say, of course, because that's what we all say, because we're optimistic. The reality is, we've still got a massive problem with storage. And if there's no wind and there's no sun for a couple of weeks, then you're not going to be sustainable.
Yeah. It's in some countries it's much easier than others. I think you need to take that with, I don't want to say best efforts because that sounds a bit pathetic, but it is, you can only
we might try.
No, but the underlying, again, it's the underlying infrastructure that is there in place in the country at the time. You can't just go, as a data centre company, we're going to be 100% green.
No.
If you don't have that infrastructure.
It's a fantastic target, we've got to go for it.
Yeah, and you've got to drive towards it, and I think that's really important. I mean, João and I have talked before about the Climate Neutral Data Centre Pact. It's been signed up to by most of the major operators, most of the hyperscalers.
Fantastic initiative. And
it's great. And that aims to be carbon neutral in most areas by 2030. Now, the argument's already going on, saying, well, actually, can we really do that? Because we don't have access to renewables, we don't have access to this or whatever it might be. The answer is, if you don't today, go and drive it, go and make it happen. Go and actually make governments realise that if you want me to be sustainable, you've got to give me some infrastructure. And that's what you've got to do, because we, again, as an industry, we're great at being victims and saying, oh yeah, well, there's nothing available for me, I can't have that. No, we've got as an industry go out and drive it and say, actually, you want me to be sustainable, and I want to be sustainable because actually I'm really good for the environment, but you've got to help me. You've got to give me the infrastructure.
Again, this is where I think the whole industry, as an infrastructure industry, needs to work together. R&D into reducing power requirements on servers, all of those things, they all need to be happening at the same time, because the more that happens, you can't just put it all on the data centre operators and say...
No, but
if you look at that, then if you look at where this comes from, this can come from government regulation, which could say all data centres have to be green by a certain time, and again that will push pricing up, but it's better for the environment, and it can come from certifications. At the moment, the only certifications that kind of waft around at the moment are uptime, which is kind of design it, whatever.
Takes no account of the green
side. A sustainability certification, and imagine if you get a big Google or Facebook or Alibaba coming in, and they value that certification, or rather, they're asked why they do not value that certification, and why they're going down the road for somebody who's got no certification in terms of sustainability or architectural sustainability, for argument's sake. So I think there's an argument to create some of those self-certifying strategies within the industry, because it helps us all.
I agree with that, and I think one of the things that may or may not come out of the Climate Neutral Data Centre Pact is some form of certification, which I think is a good thing. But I just want to go back to the servers again, because whilst you're right that we've got to encourage these server manufacturers to reduce their power, etc. We've also got to attack the developers as well. I remember when Windows used to come on 3.5-inch floppy disks. That's a huge issue in its own right, and it needs addressing. There's no question it
won't be the same. My son's just done a paper on you have a 6-leg robot. And you run a program to teach it how to behave if it loses a leg or gets damaged in any way. And the way you do that is you do a sort of Foundry application in AI. So basically you run billions and billions and billions of operations. You run it 3 meters across the room 1 billion times to work out the 5 scenarios that work if leg number 5 loses one joint or whatever. That uses...
It's horrific.
Hours. On a normal computer it would be a month. On a supercomputer it might take a couple of days, but that's probably 30 kilowatts at full power for 72 hours. And that's where it's going. Unfortunately, it's not going.
And I agree with you.
Lines of code.
No, and I agree with you. And that's why I'm sort of arguing slightly with Nicola, because unfortunately it isn't happening, and it's not going to happen. And so, whilst I think it should happen...
I don't think there's any reason why it shouldn't, other than, again, this siloed thing. I mean, maybe, I don't know, this is idealistic after a year living on my own, staring at a computer screen. My sense of total, disbelief in the world has minimised somewhat. But again, R&D money going in with those looking at it from a holistic, how it all works together. Unfortunately, we've got a legacy that's gone back over 20 years, 25 years, of these being viewed as separate entities.
But I get where you're coming from, but I just reiterate, we're not going to change the lines of code in Windows or in Office or in anything else. They're only ever going to be added to, because that's the way that
that's the way
works. And that means that the machine that you need to run those applications on, whether it be something, driving a robot that sits in a robot that or whether it's just be Microsoft Office.
Are you wondering why I had 6 legs to start with? Because I can't stop wondering that.
but I mean, you just think, that isn't going to happen. And what it means is that the machine that it's got to run on is going to be more powerful, and it's going to use more power, etc., etc., etc. What we need to do is to say, well, okay, look, you guys over there, because you are slightly separate from us. We're providing the facility to run these things. You're providing your manufacturing machine. We know you need to sort your house out. Go and do it, but that isn't going to stop us.
Yeah.
We're going to go and put our house in order anyway.
Absolutely, totally.
Couldn't that change almost be, I'm going to use the word forced, especially from emerging markets and newer markets? Because, I mean, if you have a new Microsoft being created in Africa or in India in the next 30 years, they will force the American Microsoft to change their code and to come together with others. So couldn't that be the way to do it? You just need competition.
I just don't see. I mean, it's not. Human nature is to make things more and more complex.
Yeah,
The world is going to be more and more complex. So anything that works in the opposite direction is probably working against the current. So it's just not going to happen. And one of the problems with the data centers is that we're using laws of physics, and we're still using electrons, and we're still using silicon. So whilst we use electrons and silicon, we're not going to go very far. The only super exciting innovation we've produced in the past 10 years is putting a server in Johnson's baby oil, and that's as far as we've got, which is not very.
Gives it all sorts of mental images, doesn't it?
But I mean, Guy makes a very good point. I mean, if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years, that's it. I look at some of the entries that come in for the Data Congress Awards, and I see things like, well, we've got a data center that runs on immersive cooling. Great. Yeah. So what else? That doesn't do it for me. 1999,
my data center in Zurich was powered with a pipe which pumped water from the lake. And my cooling capacity was limited by the volume of water coming through that pipe every minute. And Lake Geneva was cooling our Convention data center in Geneva. But did we have a PR budget where we could say, we're using, no, I didn't have a PR budget at Microsoft, so...
That's probably a good thing though, because when Interaction started doing that in Sweden, do you not remember the uproar about the jellyfish? Oh, yes, they were protecting jellyfish, they were all being sucked in, so maybe it was a good thing they did. And they're protecting jellyfish.
They're going into the Rhone, and the Rhone goes very fast, so that's why they took the dead bodies, it goes downstream very quickly.
But I mean, again, this whole thing about sustainable data centers, I mean, there are sustainable data centers out there, and I mean, I can think of one particularly in Luxembourg that is I mean, it goes back to the PR budget. They haven't got the PR budget to tell us how brilliant they are. I've been there. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. It runs on sustainable power. Its cooling is really innovational. Everything is great in it, and it literally has zero carbon footprint. It's fantastic, but they don't have the budget to advertise it. And I think that's a real shame, because actually they're really good and they can show other people how to do it. But what's interesting is that when we do a bit of innovation, and as you quite rightly say, go and drop a server in a bit of baby oil, those that have got the budget go out and shout about it. Well, that's not really that clever.
I don't think it actually helps the industry any either, because that's the extent of innovation in 10 years.
We can build sustainable data centers. It is possible, and it's possible today. Not everywhere. I totally agree that it can't be done everywhere, but in the Western world, it can.
Can we not get all those new Peloton users all doing it in data centers and pedal power?
Again, back in the day, this is probably 10 years ago, I was talking to a guy in Iceland who was the Tesla distributor in Iceland, and he was going to build a data center and park all the Teslas behind and use them as battery backup.
See, that's innovative thinking.
Yeah, well, 10 years later, we hear the British government talking about electric cars being used as battery backup. Well, clearly, the next step is to have a car park for charging electric cars in a data center, rip out all the UPSs, which are all using lithium-ion batteries these days anyway, and replace them with a whole bunch of cars. And as long as you've got 10% of cars in the car park, you don't need any battery backup anymore.
That solves 2 other problems of parking and charging electric cars as well.
Yeah, that's right. So
genius.
Do we need cars in the future though?
What, you mean we're all going to be on electric hoverboards?
Well, you just get an autonomous driving car.
He won't remember that in the future.
Very well, really. I'm still disappointed that never came to fruition. But
You will have Uber without the driver, so you just call the car comes to you, the car takes you, whatever.
Oh, I don't. Just there is something that
I think
fundamentally very uncomfortable.
But I think
this is just an example. I don't want to get picked up on cars, but yeah, sorry.
Do you know, just because you can do something doesn't always mean you should.
Yes, I mean,
the Reliant Robin is a brilliant example of that. So when they designed it, and all these brilliant people with their brilliant engineering minds, right, those 3 wheels, and in all the simulations and the way it was all done, it was genius until they put a person in it, and they didn't account for the fact that people would go around corners and the thing would just fall over. So again, just because something seems like a brilliant idea on paper doesn't mean when you have human beings into it, it will work how you think.
This goes back again. I don't want to take the conversation too far on cars, but it does go back to the point of electric cars. What you do with an electric car is if you move the problem, you don't actually solve the problem. You move the problem. You've taken it from the car, which is using fossil fuels, back to the power station, which is using fossil fuels, to actually generate the electricity that you're using for the car. So it's what's the big deal? Again, what needs to happen is innovation. And that will come, and I believe that actually in the future we'll be driving hydrogen-powered cars. If we're driving cars, they'll be hydrogen-powered rather than battery-powered, because I think that's a sustainable way of doing it. And 10 years ago, I was giving away hydrogen-powered cars, with toilet ones, but at data centre conferences, to show that the only byproduct of it was water. Yeah. And it's that sort of thing can happen, and I think probably will. Now you're on a different stand.
I'm just thinking I didn't either. Alex.
It was your conference though.
Was it? Oh gosh. Very disappointed.
But
have you got any left?
No. But my point being, that innovation has to come. You can't just take a problem and move it somewhere else. You've got to innovate, and that forget cars now. That also goes back to the data centre. And using electric cars to feed battery power is great, or doing other things. Hydrogen fuel cells. I believe hydrogen fuel cells may become something that will become more common in the future, either as backup power, or how about as the actual power provision, and using cars as backup. And these things they may sound a little bit silly now, but they're going to come. We've got to do it.
But I mean, if you talk about your self-driving car thing, I think what we're going to see over the next 50 years is a massive difference between cities and rural areas. So cities will become machines. There will be smart cities. All the cars will be regulated. You may not even be allowed to drive in the city at all anymore. It might just be, you hook in there just like 1E, and you basically all this little thing around the city. As soon as you get out of town, suddenly all that falls apart because there's no infrastructure. If you want to go off the road, into the country or whatever, you're going to run out of power very, very shortly. And a lot of this is based on our perception from where we are, where we're living in these tiny little countries where, in the UK, you drive any direction 150 miles and you're in the sea. Yeah. If you look at some other countries which are slightly bigger, like Brazil or Russia or whatever, you might drive 2,000 miles and there's no petrol stations. So your funny little self-driving car will have no network, no power.
Yeah, it's a very good point actually. I mean, going out of the cities and going away from flat D, then that becomes a bigger problem, and therefore the innovation needs to be better. And I think what will happen, we haven't really spoken about edge data centres per se this morning, but I think what will happen is that edge will become more normal, but edge is where the innovation will come. It's not going to come in the mainstream because they can't afford it, the investors won't want it.
The investors don't want to absolutely, at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. And indeed the companies don't want it
either. But at the moment, if you look at it philosophically, in our industry, and I guess this is the same in most industries, the least innovative companies have the highest innovation PR budget.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So, Microsoft can dip a little container under the sea and it gets on the news everywhere. But some guys in ETH in Zurich doing some really groovy stuff, well, nobody's ever going to know.
Or the guys that are building and then using the waste heat to fuel entire new development, social housing projects, you've seen Scandinavia, that sort of stuff. Is innovative and it is at least making it's not wasted. It's that we don't see very much of that.
I find it incredible that in this country and in Europe, but in general, take Scandinavia slightly out of it. I built a data centre in Sweden 20 years ago, and we reuse waste heat there. And I had a data centre in Norfolk a few years ago, and I used my waste heat there. And it wasn't expensive to put the technology in, and it saved me a shed-load of money. So I don't know why we don't do it more here. But I think, I think that kind of, and that's quite an easy, quick win, but that kind of innovation, I think, should just happen.
But again, that's more self-certification. Imagine if there was a self-certification in the industry saying, I reuse my waste heat to this level. And then imagine if the major customers, the major users, agreed that they would apply that as an eliminating factor to data center selection. There would then be motivation to actually engage and do this. At the moment, you're basically in front of the buyer like you're in front of a Walmart buyer, and it's how cheap it is. So there's no incentive to go and see the local mayor or whatever and plug into the municipal heating, because you're being beaten up on price at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid point. But if you look at government contracts that are coming out and advertised, they're all saying the same thing. They want you to be green. They want and sustainability comes really high up on their agenda. Now, that isn't to say
right, but it's the ballpark of what makes sustainability that's the problem. Because I don't think that is tough enough. All sorts of things that you can say you're sustainable, but it takes lip service.
Destroying, demolishing 1,000 cubic meters of concrete and then rebuilding it. That's probably generating more CO2 than any efficiency of data centers. So, so that's the weird thing. I've got, I use water-based geothermal in my house in France, and it's a lovely installation, and it saves loads and loads of money. It's like 11 to 1 efficiency or whatever, except it cost me a couple of grand a year to fix, and it's a massive investment. So if I were doing that commercially, I wouldn't do it, because I don't get the return on investment from the customer. So the customer has to be encouraged to say, no, I need this certification. I think that's the key.
That's a good point.
We're running out of time, but I still want to bring diversity and inclusion into the conversation. So when I say diversity and inclusion, not just women, LGBT and BAME as well. What's your views of what the industry is doing today? Is it enough? I kind of know your views as well. So I want to hear that, but we don't have much time, but we want to hear that.
I'll quickly get mine out of the way then. I think this over-focus on getting women into the industry is wrong. I think just focusing on BAME is wrong. I think just focusing on LGBTQ is wrong. That key is diversity. What we don't account for within that there is, my soapbox, as you know, is socio-economic diversity. It's all wrapped up in a big package, and you look at any HR, academia, and the thought and research into that is a well-balanced team leads to more money and leads to a better running company, because we all think differently and you need that diversity there. I think there's been an over-focus on women for the last 10 years. I think that is wrong. And I think that diversity is, and it's not even inclusion, because that gives the impression that we don't want to include people. That word inclusion, I think, actually has negative connotations, because it's like, we have to make an effort to be inclusive. And I think that's damaging. It just jars with me, and always has. It should be a focus on getting anyone who wants to come into the industry, and maybe focusing a little bit specific on areas that aren't represented, but that shouldn't be the whole focus. There's so many things that could be done that are not being done. Associations like the Infrastructure Masons, for example, what they should be doing is funding apprenticeships at university, degree level apprenticeships, not just across engineering, but across sales and marketing, across project management. Let's get those apprenticeships out there. None of the big companies offer the degree apprenticeship schemes where you work 4 days a week, 1 day at university. That would be one of the biggest leaps in terms of diversity and inclusion, and certainly from a socio-economic perspective would be a real incentive to get more people that don't necessarily want that debt hanging over them from university, or that don't know that those opportunities are there. I think we should be focusing a lot more on that. Anyway, that's
I completely agree on the apprenticeship side. I think that's brilliant, because there's a lot of people who could do well not going to university, could do well doing something completely different. I think Equinix does some apprenticeships.
Yeah, but they're not the degree, because there's 2 different types of apprenticeships. There's the straight apprentice route, where you go in as an apprentice, either post 16 or post 18. But there's the degree level as well, where your degree is paid for. It's actually funded quite a bit by there's government money there for it. So you get a degree at the end of 4 years, and you're on the job training as well. And that is very, very attractive as a pathway, certainly for those groups on that socio-economic level that need
pushing up. If you look
up.
at parallel industries, if you look at the shipping industry, my brother went and did, he went 16 16 to Merchant Navy College, went right the way through to 20 or whatever, qualified as an officer. And that was because the industry had identified the fact that they needed to train people up for a specific job. So, and I would have thought data centers probably slightly bigger than shipping these days. So yeah, it's a good thing. I just want you know.
But again, it needs an industry initiative again that pushes these things, because there's all this thing: how can we make data center industry more sexy, get people in? And certainly, as you know, when I've done quite a bit of work on the education side over the years. And it's not that people go, oh, data centers don't work there. It's they've never heard of them. So by the time they get to deciding what their career path is, they've already chosen a route, and we're not even on the radar. Going down that apprenticeship side.
I would do this, but I agree with you.
Sorry, can you get that one?
But you're right.
Say that again.
Say that
again.
We're going to record this. That's 2 minutes time already. But it's you need to be at the secondary school level talking about these data centers, and it isn't about. I agree that it's not about attracting LGBTQ or BAME or whatever. It's not about that. It's about attracting talent, and it doesn't matter what they are or who they are. It's talent. You've got to bring talent in. The only way you get talent is that when they're at secondary school, they learn about these things and they understand that actually the gaming that they do, or the the WhatsApp or whatever it might be that they're doing between themselves is actually in the middle of it all. It's a data center, and that's something which they need because it's actually critical infrastructure. And so create an interest in it at an early age. And I totally agree.
Unfortunately, I had quite a bad experience because my youngest daughter wouldn't tell her friends what her father did until she was 8 years old because she was embarrassed.
Oh, dear.
She thought I ran a dating centre.
That's slightly different.
That's brilliant.
So the editors that don't want to go there high.
But you tell people, and Alex's way of that linking it to what we do in everyday stuff. So my students, Claire Mackland, SVP of Global Marketing for Equinix, came in to talk to my students about marketing, but also went into bits about the industry. None of them, apart from one who was an apprentice and is working in tech at the moment, knew anything about it. She had more questions about the industry itself than she did about the marketing side, because they're all fascinated. So it just needs that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a STEM ambassador, and I've been into schools, and I've talked about the industry, and I've been to technology classes where they all know about how to code. They all know about what technology they're using is. But they didn't know,
where it goes.
They don't know what happens to it. They don't know that the data centre's at the end of it.
I want a TV program, right? So I think that what this world needs to get diversity, to get people interested, and for government purposes, everything else, we need a TV program that does what's his name, the history buff man, the quite sexy one. Sorry, am I allowed to say that anymore? But brings but brings it to life. So takes a subject that people are not particularly interested in and puts it on BBC Two, and all of a sudden everyone is really excited by it.
It's the way you tell the story.
Tomorrow World in mine when I was like.
But inside the internet, what happens when you send an email? What happens when satellites talk to each other?
It's appallingly done in the UK.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of a reductive Ladybird book model, and it's all done by people who say, "Oh, isn't this wonderful? I have no idea how it works."
Which you need somebody that understands all about, that looks at cabling, that looks at substations.
Maybe underlying snobbery in the UK that an engineer is a grubby person, and I couldn't even change a fuse, and that cuts right the way across, and that's not any particular section of society. That's just the way the British are.
This is what STEM is about.
So BBC, if you're watching.
Well, I mean, this is something that the Tech Capital can help with. And my last question is, what do you expect Tech Capital to do over the next few years?
What do you expect?
The Tech Capital, so
the new publication.
You expect nothing.
I'll tell you what I expect of it. What I hope of it, I'll tell you what I hope of it, is that it takes a holistic view of the industry, and we don't end up with another. And I know you won't do this, by the way, Joe, I know this, but we won't end up with another industry publication that talks excessively about cooling and what the latest, bit of downflow units are like, or variable screw drives on them. I'm not interested.
I'm not sure I know all that.
But what we need is something that is taking a holistic view, that is looking at the comms, the infrastructure, the power, the building itself, how it's run, where it is. what the demand is and why the demand is there, that looks at the growing case that data centres are critical infrastructure. They're not nice to have. They're not, without data centres, the world stops now. I mean, literally stops, because you couldn't operate a traffic light, you couldn't operate a supermarket, you couldn't transport food, you couldn't
pipeline.
Exactly.
And God forbid you wouldn't be able to access Netflix.
Exactly. so we more and more that message needs to come out. But the message, going back to what I was saying earlier, the message I think needs to come from publications like yours that are going to say, actually, look, forget that I've got 100 megawatts, forget that I've got 2,500 square meters under, built out. Stop saying all those things, because nobody's interested apart from anybody else in the industry. Start saying, these are the benefits of the industry, this is what we do, this is why we're good for the environment.
Case studies. Imagine like a Tomorrow's World type section on innovation, even the most crazy ideas, get them out there, because from crazy ideas, big things happen.
Also, I think getting people from different sectors. I mean, we've been talking to Crown, which is a Norway-based solutions provider, and they're a big Microsoft partner. We talked to them about data centers, and he said, "Oh, yeah, what's that?" You see, so you've got whole sectors even in the tech industry
that don't understand exactly.
I mean, if you could get somebody who's a performing artist or government or something like that in with some data center people, I think that could be quite interesting to see the dynamic of this.
A day in the life of, take a government minister or a person in a band and make them go work in a data centre for a day.
Fantastic.
Use my favourite example. If I want to go and get the latest Ed Sheeran CD, if somebody's going to go and extract some minerals out of the ground, transport them to a factory, go and get more minerals to transport and make into plastics for packaging, and they're going to transport that CD to somebody to get it printed, transport that CD to a distribution centre, who's going to then transport it to a shop. But rather than get in my car, go to that shop and buy it, or I download it from the internet. Now, clearly, we know which one is better, and that same thing can be applied to anything, the automotive industry, food. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. We are good for the environment, and that message is strong. But not if we keep talking about how much power we've got. We've got to stop that.
Power at all.
Instead, we've got to change the language and start saying,
what does it do? Not what is it?
This is the benefits we bring. You
make it real world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you could get someone who is, a minister or a high-end civil servant or a public figure who could actually come along, and you could use them as an example to say, well, actually, you know what? This is how the data center industry helped you to do what you do. Yeah?
And get them to do both, write a letter, put a stamp on it, post it, send it, get it back, and now send an email and follow the journeys for both. I think that's a brilliant idea.
The data centre as a marketplace. I mean, a few hundred years ago, if you had carrots, from your farm, you could either set up a stall at the end of your road and hope that maybe somebody came past with a horse and cart that day, and you might sell your carrots, but you might not. Or you go into the market every Thursday, you're guaranteed to sell your carrots. You might not get the great price, but you're guaranteed to come back with money and no carrots.
Can I just say, there's a funny looking man out there wearing a mask that keeps clicking at his watch.
No, right, well, I think it's about time we stop talking about
I was going to say, we will stop with
right in my line of sight.
I mean, Kai, Alex, and Nicola, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Good luck with the new publication. We're looking forward to reading it.
And the first thing in person, you're going to be critic, aren't you? But I mean, it's nice just to be back in person and doing these kind of things.
Absolutely.
Thank you for inviting us.
Oh, you're welcome. We'll do this a lot of times. And here's a special segment now, which I hope you will like.